I thought I was saving an alien, until he showed me the real meaning of Judgment Day. When a bleeding extraterrestrial collapsed in my arms and whispered about the second coming, I realized everything the church taught me about salvation was incomplete. What this being revealed wasn't about punishment from above. It was about a reckoning from within that's already begun. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about a truth that's been hidden behind 2,000 years of misinterpreted scripture. This alien didn't come to warn us about destruction. He came to explain what Jesus actually meant by the fire that purifies. And once you understand this, once you see what I saw glowing beneath his translucent skin, there's no going back to comfortable beliefs. This knowledge will set you free from fear, but it might shatter every certainty you've clung to about God, redemption, and what happens when the light finally comes. The being told me, your species mistakes the end for punishment, when it's actually revelation. If you're ready to see what religious institutions have kept veiled, subscribe and activate notifications, because what happened in my cabin that storm-soaked night will fundamentally change how you view your own soul. Now let me tell you how it all began. Autumn 2018. The wind tore through the Tennessee mountains with sacred fury, bending the pines like penitents in prayer. Harold Pierce lay in his narrow bed, listening to the rain drum against the cabin roof. 56 years old, former soldier, widower, a man who'd chosen isolation not as refuge but as penance. The rain had a rhythm he'd learned to trust. It spoke in a language older than words, older than guilt. Tonight it whispered of something coming. He'd almost drifted off when the sound came. Not thunder. Thunder he knew. Thunder rolled and echoed and faded into memory. This was different, heavy, metallic, a sound that didn't belong to nature but forced itself into the valley like an uninvited guest crashing through a locked door. Harold's eyes snapped open. His body moved before his mind caught up, old instincts from another life, when reaction time meant the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the sand. He was on his feet, heart hammering, adrenaline flooding his system like it had never left. Something had fallen. Close. Too close. He grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, then the rifle. The weight felt familiar in his hands, comforting in a way that probably wasn't healthy. But comfort was comfort, and he'd stopped judging himself for where he found it. The cabin door groaned as he pushed it open. The wind hit him like a fist, cold and merciless, carrying needles of rain that stung his weathered face. He stepped onto the porch, boots finding purchase on wet wood. The trail down to the clearing was treacherous in daylight. At night, in a storm, it was suicide. But something in his gut, that same instinct that had kept him alive in Kandahar and Fallujah, told him to move. So he moved. Pine branches clawed at his jacket as he descended. The flashlight beam cut through sheets of rain, illuminating a world reduced to water and shadow. His breath came in controlled bursts. The rifle barrel pointed down but ready. Then he smelled it. Ozone. Sharp and electric, like the air after lightning strikes. But underneath it something else. Iron. Blood. The scent of freshly wounded earth. Harold's pace quickened. The clearing opened before him like a throat. And there, in the center, pulsing with impossible blue light, was something that made his military training and his Christian upbringing collide in his chest like opposing armies. His heart wasn't just beating, it was pounding, a war drum, but also something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like the guilt he'd carried for 3 years, ever since the night James died. He stepped forward, mud sucked at his boots. The light wasn't steady. It pulsed, breathed, like something alive and dying at the same time. And then he saw it, saw him. The creature lay in the mud, limbs bent at angles that looked wrong even for something that wasn't human. The skin, if you could call it skin, shimmered blue-gray in the darkness, slick with something that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in silver streaks. Not blood, not like human blood, but blood all the same. Harold's finger tightened on the trigger, not pulling, just ready. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, just lay there, chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate rhythms. And then the voice came, not through the air, not through his ears. It came from inside, sliding into his consciousness like it had always been there, just waiting for permission to speak. Do not fear. 3 words. Simple, clear, impossibly calm. Harold's breath caught. His hands trembled. The rifle wavered. Do not fear, the voice repeated, softer now, almost tender. He'd spent 3 years alone in these mountains, talking to no one but ghosts. 3 years punishing himself for a split-second mistake that ended a life. And now this, whatever this was. He lowered the rifle, just slightly. His training screamed at him to run, to radio for help, to do literally anything except stand here in the rain with something impossible bleeding out in front of him. But he didn't run, because somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the shock, something else stirred. Something that felt like the moment before revelation, the moment before everything changes. Harold Pierce took a breath. Rain streamed down his face, and then he moved forward. The being's breathing came in ragged pulls, each inhale a struggle against something Harold couldn't see. Up close, the skin wasn't just blue. It was translucent, revealing faint networks of light beneath the surface, like bioluminescent rivers flowing through alien flesh. Cold. The skin was so cold. Harold touched the being's shoulder, half expecting it to disintegrate under his fingers, but it was solid, real, fragile. The eyes opened, not suddenly, but slowly, like someone waking from a dream they didn't want to leave. They were large, dark, and they held something Harold hadn't seen in another living thing for 3 years. Not pity, trust. The look didn't beg, didn't plead. It simply waited, as if knowing exactly what Harold would choose before he chose it. And maybe it did. "All right," Harold heard himself say. "All right, let's get you inside." His arm slid under the being's torso, lighter than expected. The body folded against him, and Harold felt the cold radiating through his jacket. He stood, adjusted his grip, and began the climb back to the cabin. Every step felt like walking through water. The rain fell harder. The trail had become a creek, but Harold didn't stop, couldn't stop. Something had shifted in him the moment those eyes opened. The cabin door was still open, spilling weak lamplight into the storm. He crossed the threshold, kicked the door shut behind him, and carried the being to the space near the fireplace. The fire had burned down to embers. Harold laid the creature on the old wool blanket he kept by the hearth, then moved quickly to add logs. Flames caught, grew, sent dancing shadows across the wooden walls. In the firelight, the being looked even more impossible, but also more vulnerable. Harold grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink. His hands moved on autopilot, cleaning the wound, a deep gash across the ribcage that leaked that strange silver substance. He worked carefully, remembering field medicine from another lifetime. "The time has come," the voice again, inside his head. Calm, certain. Harold's hands paused. The time for what? No answer. Just silence and the crackling fire. He returned to cleaning the wound, trying to process what was happening. An alien, an actual alien, in his cabin, speaking directly into his mind. 3 years of isolation must have finally broken something in him, except it hadn't. He knew that. This was real, impossibly, terrifyingly real. The flames suddenly trembled, as if responding to something beyond heat and wood. Harold looked up. There, burned into the floor where nothing had been before, was a symbol, an eye, wreathed in flames. The lines glowed faintly, then faded, leaving behind scorched wood. His heart kicked against his ribs. On the mantel, the photograph of Sarah, his wife, dead 4 years now from cancer, caught the candlelight. Her smile seemed different tonight, not frozen in memory, but somehow present, alive. Harold felt it then, the weight of something watching, not threatening, not even judging, just observing, waiting. He looked at the being, at the wound he'd just bandaged, at the impossible situation he'd somehow accepted as reality. "What are you?" he whispered. The creature's eyes opened fully, and in that moment, the silence in the cabin became something else, sacred. Harold had been a Christian once, before the war, before James, before the guilt turned God into a distant accuser he couldn't face. But he recognized this feeling, this presence. It wasn't peace, not yet. It was the moment before peace, the moment before everything makes sense. The being's hand moved, reaching toward him. Harold didn't pull away. The cold fingers touched his wrist, and warmth flooded through him, not physical warmth, but something deeper, like sunlight reaching soil that hadn't felt it in years. "Do not fear," the voice said again. What comes is not what you think. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, by the fire, with an alien bleeding silver on his floor and a symbol of divine fire burned into the wood, Harold Pierce felt something he hadn't felt since the night James died. Hope. Terrifying, uncontrollable hope. The being's eyes closed again, but the silence remained sacred. And Harold knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason, that his life had just split into before and after. This was the after, and there was no going back. Harold Pierce had been living in a prison for 3 years. Not one with bars or guards, but something far more unforgiving. A prison built from memory and regret, with walls made of a single moment that refused to fade. Kandahar, 2015. Night patrol. James Keller had been walking point. Harold was covering the rear. The building they'd cleared was supposed to be empty. Intel said so. Intel was wrong. The shadow moved. Harold's finger squeezed. The shot echoed. But it wasn't an enemy combatant who fell. It was James. Friendly fire. The military's polite term for killing your own brother in arms. An accident, they said. Combat conditions, they said. No charges filed, they said. But Harold had filed his own charges, every single day since. Judge, jury, and executioner. All roles he played in the court that never closed inside his head. The cabin had become his confessional, except there was no priest to offer absolution, no penance that could balance the scales. Just him and the silence and the mountains that didn't care about his guilt. God? God had become a bitter memory. Something he'd believed in once, back when the world made sense. Back when right and wrong weren't separated by a split-second decision in the dark. Now God felt distant, unreachable, a door locked from the inside, or maybe Harold had been the one who locked it. He sat there now, watching the being breathe, and felt it rising again, that familiar weight pressing down on his chest. Judgment. He was being judged. By this creature, by the universe, by whatever force had decided to crash land the impossible into his isolated existence. You carry so much, the voice came, soft as wind through pine needles. Harold's jaw tightened. You don't know what I carry. I do. 2 words. Simple. Devastating. Harold stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than it ever had. I didn't come to punish you, the voice continued, steady as a river that's been flowing since before time had a name. Harold laughed. It came out bitter. Everyone punishes me. I punish me. I know. That's why I'm here. He turned to face the being. Those dark eyes watched him with something that looked uncomfortably like understanding. The battlefield you think you left? The voice said. You brought it with you. It's here, inside. And it's been raging every single day since that night. Harold felt something crack in his chest. He was my friend. I know. I killed him. I know. There's no forgiveness for that. Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled like it was grieving with him. Then, there is. You just won't accept it. Harold's knees buckled. He didn't decide to kneel. His body just folded, like a building whose foundation had finally given way. He knelt there on the rough wooden floor, next to the scorched symbol, next to this impossible being, and felt tears mixing with the soot on his face. 3 years. 3 years he'd held this inside, locked so tight he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without the weight. The creature's hand reached out, that cold, translucent hand, and touched Harold's shoulder, and the guilt ignited. Not metaphorically. He felt it, actually felt it burning inside him like white-hot iron, like every cell in his body had been holding on to this poison, and now it was all surfacing at once, searing through him. He gasped, doubled over, wanted to scream but couldn't find the air. Let it burn, the voice said. That's what fire does. It purifies. It hurts. I know. But the fire that's coming isn't punishment, Harold. It's light. It's the only thing that can burn away what you've been carrying. The pain peaked. Harold thought he might die right there. Thought his heart might give out from the sheer intensity of feeling everything he'd been avoiding. And then, it eased. Not gone, but manageable, like a fever breaking. He lifted his head, gasping, tears streaming down his face. The being watched him with those impossibly gentle eyes. James forgave you before his last breath, the voice said quietly. Your wife forgave you before hers. God forgave you before you even pulled the trigger. The only one who hasn't forgiven you is you. Harold shook his head, but the words landed anyway, finding cracks in his armor he didn't know existed. The judgment you fear, the being continued. It's not coming from above. It never was. It's the moment you finally see yourself clearly, all of yourself, and choose love anyway. The fire popped. Sparks drifted upward like prayers. Harold stayed on his knees, hands pressed against the floor, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. But something had shifted. Something had broken open. Not healed, not yet, but open. And maybe that was enough for now. The being's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and sure, as the storm continued to rage outside, and the real storm, the one inside, finally began to quiet. Thunder split the sky like God tearing fabric. The cabin roof groaned under the assault. Rain hammered down with renewed fury, as if the heavens themselves were protesting what was about to happen inside these wooden walls. Harold was still on his knees, chest heaving, face wet with tears and rain that had somehow found its way through the roof. "The lights," the being said. "Turn them off. All of them. Except the fire." Harold looked up. Why? Because some truths can only be seen in the right light. Something in the voice made him obey. He stood on shaking legs, moved through the cabin, turning off the oil lamp, the battery-powered lantern, the small reading light by his bed. Darkness swallowed everything except the fireplace. The flames cast long shadows that danced across the walls like ancient witnesses gathering for ceremony. "Judgment doesn't come from the sky," the being said. "It begins when a man finally faces his own shadow." Harold turned back to the fire and stopped. The light had changed. Not the firelight that remained steady, orange and red, but something else was emerging, golden, liquid, like honey poured into air. The reflections spread across the room, touching the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They moved with purpose, converging at the center of the cabin, building into something that made Harold's breath catch and his heart remember rhythms it had forgotten. "What's happening?" he whispered. "You're seeing." The golden light thickened, took form. A figure began to emerge from the luminous mist, tall, wrapped in robes that somehow looked both ancient and timeless, face becoming clear through the radiance. Jesus. Not the pale European version from the paintings, not the stern judge from the sermons, but a face that held the weight of every human sorrow and somehow remained gentle, compassionate, present. Harold couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't speak with words, didn't need to. The presence itself communicated everything, every truth about love and loss and guilt and grace that Harold had spent 3 years running from. "There is no fear in love." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Inside Harold's head, inside his chest, inside the room itself. Perfect love casts out fear. He'd heard that verse 1,000 times in church, had memorized it as a child, but hearing it and feeling it were different universes. Harold trembled. Not from fear, though fear was there, but from something bigger. The faith he'd lost, the faith he'd buried under guilt and shame and 3 years of self-imposed exile, was knocking on the door of his heart, pounding on it, demanding to be let back in. "I don't understand," he managed to say, but the figure only smiled. Such compassion in that smile, such acceptance. The vision began to fade. The golden light pulled back, retreating like tide from shore. The figure dissolved into mist, into memory, into something Harold knew he'd carry forever. The cabin returned to normal. Fire and shadows, rain and wind. Just him and the being. Harold stood there, shaking, face wet with new tears. What was that? The reflection of truth, the being said quietly. What you saw wasn't separate from you. It was the part of you that never stopped believing. The part that knows love is stronger than guilt, light stronger than darkness. But I saw Jesus. You saw what Jesus represented. The consciousness that understands judgment isn't about condemnation. It's about finally seeing yourself clearly and choosing love anyway. Harold sank into the chair by the fire. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "The second coming everyone fears," the being continued. "It's not punishment from above. It's awakening from within. It's every human heart that finally stops running from its own shadow and turns to face the light." Thunder rolled again, but quieter now. The storm was passing. "The fire that's coming," the being said, "will burn through every lie you've told yourself, every wall you've built, every prison you've locked yourself inside. And yes, it will hurt. But not because God is angry, because truth always hurts before it heals. Harold looked at the being, this impossible visitor who'd crashed into his mountains and his life, and somehow knew every dark corner of his soul. "Why me?" he asked. "Why tell me this?" "Because you were ready. You didn't know it, but you were. 3 years of isolation, 3 years of punishment, 3 years of building the pressure until something had to break." The being's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. "And now it has. Now you've seen. And you can't unsee it, Harold. The truth doesn't come with an off switch." Harold nodded slowly. He understood. Not completely, maybe no one could completely understand, but enough. Enough to know that nothing would ever be the same. The storm outside continued its retreat. Inside, by the fire, with an alien messenger and the lingering presence of divine compassion, Harold Pierce felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not peace, not yet, but hope. Real, undeniable, terrifying hope. And that was enough. The fire had burned down to steady coals, casting the cabin in warm amber light. Harold sat forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, trying to process everything that had just happened. The being shifted slightly, the silver substance on the bandage catching the light. When it spoke again, the voice carried a weight that made the air itself seem to listen. "The final judgment," it began, "is not destruction." Harold looked up. "Everyone thinks it is. The Bible says, the Bible was written by humans trying to describe the indescribable. They used the language they had. Fire, wrath, separation. But they were describing something else entirely. What then?" The being's eyes held steady on him. The collapse of separated consciousness. The collective awakening. Harold shook his head. "I don't understand." "You will. The fire that's coming. The one prophesied, feared, anticipated for 2,000 years. It's not flames that consume flesh. It's light that reveals what humanity has been hiding." The words settled into the room like snow, quiet but accumulating into something that couldn't be ignored. Hiding from what? Harold asked. From themselves, from each other, from the truth of what they are. Harold's military mind wanted clarity, wanted tactical understanding. "You're saying Judgment Day is what? Some kind of mass revelation?" "Exactly that." The being's voice carried something that might have been satisfaction. "Every lie will become visible. Every secret will surface. Every wall between souls will dissolve. Not because of punishment, because of light. Pure, undiluted, uncompromising light." Harold thought about his own secrets. The guilt he'd carried. The shame he'd hidden even from himself. The idea of all of that becoming visible made his stomach turn. "That sounds like hell," he said quietly. "To those who've built their identity on lies? Yes, it will feel like hell. But to those ready to face truth?" The being paused. "It will feel like coming home." Thunder rumbled in the distance, softer now, like an echo of earlier fury. Jesus will return as frequency, not form. Harold blinked. What does that mean? He won't arrive on clouds with trumpets. He won't judge from a throne. His return is the elevation of human consciousness to the frequency he embodied. Love. Pure, unconditional, transformative love. When that frequency reaches critical mass, everything that can't match it will be revealed for what it is. The being leaned forward slightly, and Harold felt the intensity of its gaze. The truth will dissolve every interior lie, every false self, every mask, every defense mechanism humanity has built over millennia to avoid facing their own divinity. The words landed like soft thunder in Harold's soul, not loud, but reverberating, echoing in chambers he didn't know existed inside him. His mind struggled to hold it all. Consciousness, frequency, collective awakening. It sounded like science fiction mixed with mysticism, yet something in his chest recognized it as true, deeper than belief, cellular. "So all those people," Harold said slowly, "all those Christians waiting for Jesus to come back and save them from the world, are waiting for something external to do what only they can do internally. Jesus showed the way. He became the way. But the walking of it, that's always been humanity's job." Harold thought about his years in church. The sermons about being saved, about grace coming from above, about waiting for deliverance. "We've been waiting for rescue," he said, "when you were meant to remember who you are." Shame washed through him then. Not the crushing guilt about James. Different. This was shame for how much time he'd wasted, how many years spent cowering from light, treating it as threat instead of truth. I was afraid, he whispered. All those years. I was afraid of what I'd see if I really looked at myself. Everyone is. That's why judgment feels like punishment. Not because of what God does, because of what humans finally have to face about themselves. The being's voice softened then, becoming tender in a way that reminded Harold of forgiveness. Real forgiveness. The kind that doesn't minimize wrong but sees past it to the frightened child beneath. But here's what they don't teach in churches, the being continued. Judgment isn't condemnation. It's seeing yourself whole, all of you, light and shadow, and accepting it anyway. Loving yourself anyway. That's the fire. That's the test. Can you see all of who you are and still choose love? Harold felt tears building again. I don't know if I can. You already have. Tonight, when you faced your guilt instead of running, when you let the pain burn through you instead of numbing it, that was judgment, and you survived. The fire popped, sending sparks upward like tiny prayers ascending. The final judgment everyone fears is just that moment, multiplied across every soul on earth simultaneously, every human seeing themselves clearly, all at once, with no place to hide and no one to blame, and then choosing, love or fear, unity or separation, truth or lies. Harold sat back, overwhelmed. And those who choose wrong, there is no wrong. There are only consequences. Fear breeds more fear. Separation breeds more separation. But eventually, after enough lifetimes of choosing pain, every soul comes home. Because that's what love does. It waits. Forever, if necessary. The cabin felt sacred now, like a church without walls, a confessional without shame, a sanctuary built from truth instead of tradition. Harold looked at this impossible being, this messenger who'd crashed into his mountains and his life with revelations that shattered everything he thought he knew about God and judgment and the end of the world. Why tell me? He asked again. I'm nobody, just a broken soldier hiding in the woods. The being's expression might have been a smile, hard to tell with features so different from human. You're exactly who needs to hear this. The broken ones, the hidden ones, the ones who've already faced their own darkness and survived. You're the ones who'll understand when the light comes. You're the ones who won't run. Harold nodded slowly, understanding settling into his bones like warmth after long cold. Judgment, the being said one more time, is seeing yourself whole and accepting yourself anyway. That's all it ever was. That's all it will ever be. And in that moment, sitting in his cabin with an alien messenger and the weight of impossible truths, Harold Pierce finally understood what grace actually meant. Not rescue from consequences, but love powerful enough to face them. Exhaustion hit Harold like a physical weight. The emotional intensity of the night had drained him more thoroughly than any firefight ever had. His eyes grew heavy despite everything, despite the impossibility sleeping in his cabin, despite the revelation still echoing in his mind. He dozed off in the chair without meaning to, and immediately, he was back. Kandahar, the night patrol, the building that Intel had cleared, but this time the dream was different, more vivid, more real. Like memory had been waiting for permission to show him what really happened. James walked point, rifle up, moving with the careful precision of a man who'd survived 3 deployments. Harold covered rear, heart pounding that familiar combat rhythm. The shadow moved in the doorway. Harold's fingers squeezed. The shot rang out, impossibly loud, echoing forever. James fell. But in the dream, Harold could see more than he'd seen that night. Could see James's face as he turned. The expression wasn't surprise or betrayal or pain. It was understanding. Brother, James said, blood mixing with dust on his lips. Brother, it wasn't your fault. Harold tried to move, tried to reach him, but his legs wouldn't work. Fear pulled that trigger, James continued, voice fading. Not you. Fear lives in all of us. You just had to be the one carrying it that night. No, Harold heard himself saying. No, it was me. I did it. It was fear. A new voice said. Divine. Familiar. The same voice that had spoken through the golden light in the cabin. Fear is the only enemy there ever was. Fear of death. Fear of failure. Fear of not being enough. The dream shifted. James stood now, whole and healthy, wearing white that somehow didn't look out of place in the desert. Your hand pulled the trigger, James said gently. But fear aimed the gun. Do you see the difference? I killed you. Fear killed me. And then you let it kill you too. 3 years, Harold. 3 years you've been dead. Walking, breathing, but dead inside. The scene dissolved. Harold felt himself pulling back toward consciousness, fighting it, wanting to stay, needing to hear more. It wasn't your fault, James called after him. It was never your fault. Harold's eyes snapped open. He was gasping, sweating. His shirt clung to his skin despite the coolness of the cabin. The being sat exactly where it had been, watching him with those impossibly patient eyes. The dream, Harold managed. James, fear is the true enemy of the soul, the being said quietly. Not bullets, not accidents, not even death. Fear is what keeps humanity imprisoned. Fear of unworthiness, fear of judgment, fear of being seen for what they truly are. Harold wiped his face with shaking hands. When a person conquers fear, the being continued, heaven begins inside them, not after death, not in some distant reward, right here, right now. Heaven as a state of being, not a destination. Harold looked toward the window. The storm had passed completely. Through the glass, he could see the first hints of dawn touching the mountains. The forest outside seemed to breathe with new life, trees standing taller, the air itself clearer. The storm, he said slowly, was inside you. Always was. The weather just matched it. Harold laughed then, a sound of recognition and release. How much of his life had been storm? How much of the chaos he'd blamed on external circumstances had actually been his own interior weather system raging? The laughter turned to crying, not the desperate sobbing from earlier. This was different. This was surrender. The kind of tears that come when someone finally stops fighting and lets themselves be held by something bigger than their pain. I'm so tired, he whispered. I know. Fighting yourself is the most exhausting war there is. Harold cried like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater for 3 years and finally surfaced. Cried like someone delivering their body and soul to forgiveness after refusing it for so long it had become habit. The being didn't move, didn't offer comfort or platitudes, just sat there, present and steady, like a lighthouse in fog. And slowly, as the tears subsided and the dawn grew stronger through the window, Harold felt something he'd forgotten was possible. Peace, not as a concept, not as something he hoped for or worked toward or earned through enough punishment. Peace as presence, as reality, as something that had always been there beneath the storm, waiting for him to stop fighting long enough to notice. It filled his chest, his lungs, his limbs. It wasn't happiness, wasn't the absence of pain. It was bigger than both. It was the deep knowing that despite everything, despite James, despite the guilt, despite 3 years of self-imposed exile, he was still here, still breathing, still capable of love, still whole. This, he said quietly, voice rough from crying, this is what you meant, about judgment being acceptance. The being nodded, seeing yourself completely, all the broken pieces, all the mistakes, all the fear, and choosing to love anyway. That's the fire that purifies. That's the light that saves. Harold sat in his chair as dawn painted the cabin gold. An alien messenger sat across from him. Outside, the Tennessee mountains stood eternal and unmoved. And inside, for the first time in 3 years, Harold Pierce was at peace. Not because the past had changed, but because he finally had. The being's voice changed. It had been telepathic before, formless, genderless, coming from inside Harold's mind like thoughts that weren't his own. But now it took on texture, tone, something almost human but not quite, like hearing someone speak through water. Sweet, firm, undeniable. Jesus didn't come to found a religion, the being said, and the words landed with the weight of mountains settling. He came to rekindle the love you'd forgotten. Harold leaned forward, every cell in his body listening. For millennia, humanity buried its own divinity under rules and rituals and hierarchies, built temples to house what was never meant to be contained, created gatekeepers for what was always freely given. The dawnlight grew stronger through the window, painting the cabin in shades of gold and amber. Jesus came to remind you, that's all, to show you what was always true, that love isn't a commandment, it's your natural state. That power isn't something to petition for, it's already within you. That heaven isn't somewhere you go, it's what you become. Harold thought about the churches he'd attended. The sermons he'd heard, the prayers he'd offered up to a God who seemed perpetually distant, perpetually disappointed. "We got it wrong," he said quietly. "Not wrong, incomplete. You focused on worship when he demonstrated partnership. You practiced obedience when he taught empowerment. You waited for salvation when he showed you how to save yourselves." The being shifted, and Harold noticed the wound had stopped bleeding. The silver substance had crystallized, forming something that looked almost like mother of pearl. "Every heart that awakens," the being continued, "is a star returning to the source. Every person who remembers their own divinity is a light coming back online in a grid that's been dark too long." Harold listened the way he used to listen to commanding officers in the military, with absolute attention, knowing his life might depend on understanding every word. Except this was different. This commander wasn't ordering him into battle. This commander was calling him home. "The true judgment," the being said, "is when you choose light even after the error. When you face what you've done, really face it, no excuses, no blame, and choose love anyway. That's when transformation happens. Not before the mistake, after." Harold felt the truth of it resonating in his chest. "Hell isn't a place," the being continued. "It's the refusal to see yourself with love. It's the choice to remain in separation, to cling to unworthiness, to reject the very forgiveness that's always been offered." The words hit like revelation. Harold thought about his wife, Sarah, the way she'd looked at him during those final days as the cancer ate through her. He'd been so wrapped up in his own guilt about James, so convinced he didn't deserve her love, that he'd almost missed it. But not quite. He remembered now, the way her eyes had held him even when her body was failing, the way she'd reached for his hand and whispered, "You have to forgive yourself, Harold. Promise me. You have to let it go." He hadn't been able to promise, hadn't been able to let it go, until now. "She forgave you long ago," the being said, and something in its expression might have been a smile. "Before she even died, she saw past your guilt to the man beneath, to the good heart that made one terrible mistake and couldn't stop punishing itself." Harold's vision blurred with tears. "She forgave you," the being repeated gently. "James forgave you. God forgave you before you even asked. The universe itself has no concept of unforgiveness, only humans do. Only you create that prison and lock yourselves inside." Harold dropped to his knees, not from weakness this time, from gratitude, from pain that was finally transmuting into something else, something that felt like freedom. "All this time," he whispered, "all this wasted time. Not wasted, necessary. Every moment of suffering taught you something, prepared you for this one. You couldn't have heard this truth 3 years ago. You had to descend into your own hell first so you'd recognize heaven when it came." Harold pressed his forehead to the rough wooden floor. Tears fell freely now, mixing with the dust and the residue of the scorched symbol that still marked the boards. "Then the fire," he said, voice breaking. "The fire everyone fears. It's not punishment. No, it's grace." The being's voice filled with warmth. "Yes, always was. The fire that burns away everything that isn't love, everything that isn't true. It hurts God. Does it hurt? Because lies resist dying. But on the other side, freedom, peace, the remembering of who you actually are." Harold stayed on his knees, breathing hard, feeling like every cell in his body was reorganizing itself around this new understanding. Grace, not as theological concept, not as something doled out by priests or earned through penance. Grace as fire, as light, as the force that loves you enough to burn away everything you use to hide from yourself. "I spent 3 years hiding," Harold said. "I know. I was so afraid of the light. Everyone is, until they're not." Harold lifted his head. Through tear-blurred vision, he saw the being watching him with such tenderness it made his chest ache. "You're not hiding anymore," the being said simply. "That's what matters. You stood in the fire. You faced the light. You saw yourself whole, all the shadow, all the pain, all the guilt, and you're still here, still breathing, still choosing. Choosing what? Love, despite everything. That's the choice that changes worlds." The sun had fully risen now. Light streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny galaxies in the air between them. Harold felt it then, really felt it. Not just understood intellectually, but felt in his bones and blood and breath. The fire was grace, judgment was love, And everything he'd been taught to fear was actually the doorway home. He nodded slowly, understanding settling into him like rain into parched earth. "Thank you," he whispered. The being inclined its head. "You did the hard part. You opened the door. I just walked through." Harold stayed on his knees a moment longer, letting the truth soak all the way through him. Then he stood, wiping his face, feeling lighter than he had in years. Different. Changed. Born again. But not the way he'd learned in church. Born again as in, remembering who he'd always been beneath the fear. And that made all the difference. The being stood slowly, testing its weight. The wound had healed faster than should have been possible, the crystallized silver forming an intricate pattern across its torso that caught the morning light. "Open the window," it said. Harold moved to the cabin's single window and pushed it open. Cool mountain air flooded in, carrying the scent of pine and rain-washed earth. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean. The night, or what remained of it before dawn fully claimed the sky, was impossibly calm. Stars still visible between the dissolving clouds, dancing in that liminal space between darkness and day. "Look at them," the being said, moving to stand beside Harold. Harold looked up. The stars seemed brighter than usual, pulsing with light that felt almost alive. "Their eyes," the being continued, voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "Eyes of the same God that lives inside you, the same consciousness, the same love. Distance is illusion. Separation is illusion. It's all one light expressing itself through infinite forms." Harold stared at the stars and felt something shift in his perception, like seeing a magic eye painting suddenly resolve into 3 dimensions. They weren't just burning balls of gas millions of miles away. They were watching, aware, part of a vast consciousness that included him, the mountains, the being beside him, everything. A blue flash suddenly erupted in the valley below. Harold startled, but the being remained calm. The light rose slowly, a column of azure radiance that reflected off the dried silver blood still staining the cabin floor. It pulsed with the same rhythm Harold had noticed earlier, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like life itself rendered visible. "My ship," the being explained, "repairing itself, consciousness directing matter back into form." "How?" "Matter bends to the light of consciousness. Always has. You've just forgotten how to see it, how to do it yourselves." The being's voice changed then, becoming more human, carrying an emotion that Harold recognized as grief mixed with hope. "My people fear judgment too," it said quietly. "We're not so different from you. We reached the stars, mastered technology you'd call miraculous, but we still struggle with the same basic truth, that we're worthy of love exactly as we are." Harold looked at the being's profile, illuminated by starlight and the blue glow from the valley. "But we learned," the being continued, "after cycles of war and separation and building the same prisons you're building now. We learned that judgment isn't punishment, it's healing. It's the moment consciousness decides to stop lying to itself." The blue light pulsed brighter, then began to fade. "You're close," the being said, turning to face Harold. "Humanity is so close to understanding the same thing. The frequency is rising, more hearts are waking up. More people are questioning the old stories, seeing through the lies, remembering what they've always known but were taught to forget." Harold felt something kindle in his chest, not just hope, though hope was there, something more certain, like a promise being kept. "The fire that's coming," he said slowly, "it won't destroy us. No, it will reveal you. Every person will see themselves clearly, all at once. The lies will dissolve like mist in sunlight. And yes, for those who've built entire identities on falsehood, it will feel like dying. But death is just transformation wearing a scary mask." The being placed its hand over its own chest where the wound had been. "This pain," it said, "the crash, the injury, the fear when I didn't know if I'd survive. It taught me something I thought I already knew. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the doorway to connection. I couldn't have met you from a place of power. You wouldn't have trusted me, you wouldn't have helped." Harold understood. He'd helped because the being was broken, just like him. "We're all wounded healers," the being said as if reading his thoughts. "Every teacher is also a student. Every guide is also lost. That's the beautiful truth they don't tell you. Everyone is figuring it out as they go. Even us. Even beings who've traveled the stars." The emotion in the voice made it crack slightly. "But you know what we learned?" the being continued. After all our fear, all our resistance to judgment, that it's actually beautiful, terrifying, yes, painful, absolutely, but beautiful. Because it's the moment truth becomes impossible to avoid. And truth, for all its sharp edges, is the only thing that actually sets anyone free. Harold felt heat in his chest, not painful, illuminating, like internal sunrise. The faith he'd lost was coming back, but different. Not the fearful religion of his youth built on obedience and unworthiness. Something simpler, more direct, more real. Faith as trust, as knowing, as certainty that beneath all the chaos and pain and confusion, something loving holds everything together. I can feel it, Harold whispered, coming back. It never left. You just couldn't see it through the storm. The being smiled, actually smiled, the expression transforming its alien features into something Harold recognized as joy. The fire is grace, Harold said, testing the words again, feeling their truth solidify. Yes, the judgment is love. Yes, and we're not separate from God. We're God remembering itself. Now you're seeing it. The being's eyes glowed faintly. That's the gospel they edited out. The truth too powerful to contain in any institution. You're not saved by God, you're expressions of God, waking up to what you've always been. Harold stood at the window, stars above, mountains around him, an impossible being beside him, and felt his faith return, not as belief system, as lived reality, simple, unshakable, true. The fire was coming, the judgment was coming, the great revealing was already beginning, and he wasn't afraid anymore, because the light that burns away lies is the same light that illuminates truth, and truth, he finally understood, was just another word for love. Harold turned from the window, the question burning in him too urgently to contain any longer. Why me? He asked, looking directly at the being. Of all the people in the world, all the priests and prophets and people who actually kept their faith, why crash here? Why tell me all this? The being regarded him with those deep, impossibly gentle eyes. Because you isolated yourself to escape the pain, it said simply, and pain is the doorway to revelation. Harold felt the words land somewhere beneath his ribs. You think you came here to hide, the being continued, to punish yourself away from the world. But the universe doesn't work that way. What you call exile, the divine calls preparation. What you call punishment, love calls incubation. The morning light strengthened, painting the cabin walls in shades of honey and gold. Solitude is the field where God whispers without noise, the being said. In the chaos of the world, the voice gets lost. Too many distractions, too many other voices. But here, it gestured to the cabin, the mountains beyond. Here there's nothing between you and truth, nowhere left to run, no one left to perform for. Harold lowered his eyes, understanding flooding through him like a river finding its course. 3 years. 3 years he'd thought he was hiding from God, from judgment, from the life he'd destroyed. But maybe he'd actually been preparing for this night, this encounter, this revelation that would change everything. The people in churches, he said quietly, the ones still going through the motions. They're not ready? Some are, some aren't. Readiness isn't about righteousness. It's about rupture, about being broken open enough that light can finally get in. You were broken, Harold, shattered, and that made you perfect for this message. The being raised its hand slowly, deliberately. A golden glow began to emanate from its palm, spreading outward like dawn breaking inside the cabin itself. The light wasn't harsh, it was warm, welcoming, alive with a presence that made Harold's breath catch. The air shimmered, reality seemed to thin, becoming translucent, and then Harold saw them, faces emerging from the golden light. Not ghosts, something more real than that, more present, more there than anything in the physical world around him. James appeared first, the friend Harold had killed, but there was no wound, no blood, no accusation in his eyes. Just that familiar crooked smile that Harold had loved, had missed with an ache that never quite faded. Brother, James said, and Harold heard it not with his ears but with something deeper. You've been carrying me like a weight. I was never that. I'm light. Always was. Sarah materialized beside him, Harold's wife, beautiful despite the cancer that had ravaged her body in those final months. Or maybe beautiful because of it, because suffering had refined her into something purely luminous. My love, she said, and the words wrapped around Harold like an embrace. I never left. You just couldn't see me through the guilt. More faces appeared. Harold's mother, dead 15 years. His father. His grandfather who'd taught him to hunt in these same mountains. People he'd served with. People he'd loved. People he'd lost. All of them smiling. All of them radiating a peace so profound, it made Harold's chest ache with longing. They live in the light you refuse to see, the being said softly. Death isn't ending. It's transition. They moved into a frequency you couldn't perceive because you were vibrating at the frequency of guilt and fear. But they've always been here. Always been close. Always been loving you. Harold's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, tears pouring down his face unchecked. I thought I'd lost them, he choked out. I thought death meant gone forever. Death means transformation. The body falls away, but consciousness? Consciousness is eternal. It just shifts into a form your physical eyes can't track, but your heart can, your soul can. That's why you felt them sometimes, in the wind, in the quiet moments, in the dreams you dismissed as wishful thinking. Sarah stepped forward, or maybe she didn't step. Maybe she just was suddenly closer. She reached out, and though Harold knew on some level that her hand was made of light and memory and something beyond physical matter, he felt it touch his face. Felt it. Actually felt it. You have to let go now, she whispered. Not of us. We're not going anywhere. Let go of the guilt, the shame, the belief that you don't deserve this love. I killed him, Harold said, looking at James. I killed my best friend. You made a mistake, James replied. In the dark, in the chaos, under impossible pressure, and then you made it mean something about your worthiness. That's the only tragedy, Harold. Not the bullet. The belief that it made you unforgivable. The golden light pulsed brighter, and Harold felt something in his chest begin to dissolve. Something that had been locked tight for 3 years. A fist of shame that had been clenched so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be open. The judgment you feared, the being said, was never about condemnation. It's this. It's reunion. It's seeing everyone you've lost and everyone you've hurt and everyone you think couldn't possibly forgive you, and discovering they already have. They always did. Only you held on to the separation. Harold looked at all the faces surrounding him in the golden glow. No judgment, no anger, no disappointment, just love. Infinite, unchanging, unconditional love. Then judgment is reunion, he whispered, understanding breaking over him like a wave. Not condemnation, not punishment, just coming home. Yes, the being said, and its voice carried the weight of galaxies and the tenderness of a mother. It's the return to unity, the remembering that you were never actually separate. That love never breaks, even when bodies do. That consciousness continues, connection persists, and the only thing that ever divides anyone is the belief in division itself. The faces began to fade, the golden light receding like tide pulling back from shore. But they left something behind, a warmth, a presence, a knowing that they weren't gone, just invisible again, close as breath, constant as heartbeat. Harold stayed on his knees, tears streaming, chest heaving with sobs that were somehow grief and joy simultaneously. Thank you, he whispered to the light, to the being, to the universe itself. Thank you for showing me. The being lowered its hand. The golden glow faded completely, leaving only morning sunlight and the simple truth it had illuminated. Death wasn't ending, judgment wasn't punishment, and love was the only thing that had ever been real. Everything else was just fear wearing different masks. Dawn opened across the Tennessee mountains like a silent revelation. The being stood slowly, testing its body with movements that suggested complete healing. The wound was gone, not scarred, but gone, as if it had never existed. The crystallized silver had dissolved, leaving behind only smooth, luminous skin that seemed to glow faintly with its own internal light. Serenity radiated from it like heat from a fire, not peace as absence of trouble, but peace as presence of something absolute, unshakable, true. I need to go, it said simply. Harold's heart clenched. Already? There are many hearts ready to awaken, many people standing at the same threshold you just crossed. They need what you needed, someone to show them that judgment is love, that death is transition, that they're not as broken as they believe. Harold wanted to argue, wanted to keep this being here, in his cabin, where the impossible felt manageable and the divine felt close enough to touch. But he understood. This wasn't about him, had never been only about him. "What do I do now?" he asked, and heard the vulnerability in his own voice. The being tilted its head, that expression that might have been a smile playing across its features. "Live as someone who forgave the world." 4 words. Simple, world-changing. Not someone trying to earn forgiveness, the being clarified. Not someone performing righteousness or convincing others of truth. Just someone who forgave, who saw all the brokenness and fear and violence and cruelty humanity carries, and chose love anyway. Harold nodded slowly. "That's all? That's everything. When you forgive the world, you stop waiting for it to be different before you can be at peace. You stop demanding that others change before you can love them. You become the light instead of searching for it outside yourself." The being moved toward the door, and Harold followed, unable to let this moment end without understanding it completely. "Will I see you again?" he asked. "You'll see me every time you choose love over fear, every time you forgive instead of condemn, every time you remember that separation is illusion." The being paused at the threshold. "I'm not going away, Harold. I'm just becoming invisible to your eyes again, but I'm always as close as your next thought." The light began to build around the being, not golden this time, but that same azure blue from the crash site. It started at the being's core and spread outward, enveloping it in radiance that was somehow both gentle and absolute. "The second coming everyone fears," the being's voice came, already sounding distant. "It's happening now, not as a single event, but as a million individual awakenings. Every heart that chooses light, every person who faces their shadow, every soul that remembers love. That's the return. That's the resurrection. That's the fire that transforms the world." The blue light intensified until Harold had to shield his eyes. "Tell them," the being's voice echoed. "Tell anyone ready to hear. The judgment isn't coming to punish. It's already here to heal. The fire isn't coming to destroy. It's already burning away every lie that keeps you from knowing who you truly are." The light became blinding. Harold closed his eyes, feeling warmth on his face like standing in summer sun. When he opened them again, the being was gone. No sound, no dramatic exit, just absence where presence had been. Except it wasn't really absence. Harold could still feel it, a warmth in his chest, a lightness in his body, a knowing that something fundamental had shifted and could never shift back. He walked outside onto the porch. The valley spread before him, mountains rising like prayers into the clean morning sky. The storm had washed everything new. The air smelled of pine and possibility. In the distance, where the being's ship had been, there was nothing. No scorched earth, no evidence. Just forest and meadow, and the eternal indifference of nature to human categories of possible and impossible. Harold smiled, then laughed, then found himself crying again. But these tears were different. They were release. They were gratitude. They were the overflow of a heart that had been locked shut for 3 years and had finally opened. He walked back into the cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to nothing. The scorched symbol on the floor was the only physical evidence that any of this had happened. That, and the fact that Harold Pierce, broken soldier, guilty exile, man who'd believed he was beyond forgiveness, was smiling. For the first time in 3 years, he felt no fear. Not about the past, not about James, not about God or judgment, or whether he deserved to be alive. He felt instead what the being had described. Peace, not as idea or hope or distant goal. Peace as presence, as reality, as the ground truth beneath everything else. Harold moved to the window and looked out at the awakening day. Somewhere in the world, other people were having their own encounters. Other hearts were breaking open. Other souls were remembering what they'd always been, but had forgotten in the noise and pain and confusion of being human. The fire was coming. The judgment was already here. And it was love. It had always been love. Everything else was just the story fear told to keep people small. Harold picked up his journal from the table, opened to a blank page, and began to write. Not because he had to, not because anyone was asking, but because testimony is what light does. It shines, it shares, it illuminates without demanding, without forcing, without needing anyone to believe. It just glows, and lets whoever is ready see. 3 days after the being left, Harold walked the mountain trails with a heart that felt weightless, not empty, weightless, like a balloon released after being held underwater for years, rising naturally, effortlessly, toward something that had always been pulling it upward. His boots crunched on fallen leaves, still damp from the storm. The air held that crystalline quality of autumn mornings in the Appalachians, sharp enough to wake you up, soft enough to feel like grace. The trees seemed different, or maybe he was different and could finally see them properly. They swayed in the breeze, branches moving in patterns that looked almost like dancing. Pine needles whispered secrets to each other. Birch bark gleamed white as revelation in the slanting morning light. Harold stopped on an outcropping of rock, looking down at the valley where the ship had been. Nothing remained except memories and a certainty that lived deeper than memory, in his bones, in his breath, in the way his heart beat steadier now than it had in years. The trees were singing. He was sure of it now. Not with voices or melody, but with a frequency he was only just learning to perceive. The frequency the being had talked about, the one Jesus had embodied, the one that was always present if you got quiet enough to hear it. Love. The universe was singing love, and Harold was finally listening. He returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher, walked to the small shed where he kept tools and supplies, retrieved the shovel. The rifle had been leaning against the wall inside the cabin for 3 years. Loaded, always loaded. Not because he feared intruders, but because some part of him had been waiting for the courage to use it on himself. He'd never admitted that, not even to himself, but it was true. Now he carried it outside, feeling its weight differently, not as comfort or threat, but as symbol, as artifact from a war that had finally ended. Harold chose a spot in the backyard, beneath the old oak that Sarah had loved, dug until the hole was deep enough that no one would accidentally unearth it, placed the rifle in the ground like a coffin, like a past being buried so a future could grow, covered it with earth, patted the soil down, said no words because none were needed. The war was over. The interior battlefield had gone quiet. Peace had been negotiated not through victory but through surrender, the kind where you stop fighting yourself and let love win. Back inside, Harold looked at Sarah's photograph. It had sat on the mantel for 4 years, gathering dust, facing a room he barely lived in because living hurt too much. He took it down gently, wiped the glass clean with his sleeve, carried it to the window, the same window where he'd stood with the being, looking at stars that were eyes of God. He placed the photo on the sill, facing outward, so Sarah could see the mountains she'd loved, so her smile could greet each sunrise, so she could be part of his life again instead of a shrine to guilt. "I'm sorry I hid you away," he whispered. "I'm sorry I made your death about my failure instead of about your life." The photo didn't answer, but the light caught it just right, and for a moment, just a moment, Harold could swear she winked at him. He laughed, actually laughed. The sound felt rusty but real. That evening he sat on the porch and watched the sun descend behind the western ridgeline. The sky blazed orange and pink and purple, colors so vivid they seemed to be showing off. Harold watched without thinking, without analyzing, without doing anything except witnessing beauty being beautiful. It felt like prayer, better than prayer. It felt like conversation, the universe speaking in sunset, and him responding with attention and awe and wordless gratitude. Each evening after that, he did the same, made it a practice, a ritual without rigidity, just sitting, just watching, just letting the day release him, and the night welcome him, and the in-between teach him about transitions. He began to write, not for publication or posterity, but because the words needed somewhere to go. He wrote about the crash, the being, the revelations that had shattered and rebuilt his understanding of everything. "The judgment will not come," he wrote one morning as dawn painted his pages gold, "because it's already here, already happening, already burning through the lies we tell ourselves about unworthiness and separation and the impossibility of grace. It's happening inside us. In every moment we choose to see ourselves truly and love ourselves anyway. In every instant we forgive instead of condemn. In every breath we take as someone who remembers they're made of light." He didn't show anyone, didn't seek validation or agreement. The writing was its own reward, testimony to no one and everyone, truth spoken into existence because truth deserves to exist. One day, needing supplies, Harold drove into town, the small cluster of buildings that counted as civilization in this part of Tennessee, a general store, a diner, a post office that doubled as gossip central. People stared. He understood why. He'd become a ghost over the past 3 years, the hermit in the mountains, the man broken by war and loss who'd chosen isolation over community. But now he smiled, greeted folks by name, asked about their families, and meant it when he listened to the answers. Martha Henderson, who ran the general store, actually dropped a jar of pickles. "Harold Pierce," she said, staring at him like he'd risen from the grave. Are you all right?" "I am," he said simply. "Better than all right. You look different. I feel different." He did. He felt like someone who'd died and been reborn, which was exactly what had happened. The old Harold, the one carrying guilt like a cross he'd nailed himself to, was gone, dead, buried beneath an oak tree with a rifle. This Harold was lighter, freer, not without pain. The past hadn't vanished, but no longer imprisoned by it. The wounds were still there, but they'd become something else. Scars, yes, but scars that glowed faintly when the light hit them right. Proof of survival, evidence of healing, maps of a journey through darkness that had ended in dawn. His faith had returned, but not the faith of his youth, built on obligation and fear of divine disappointment. This faith was simpler, more direct, less about belief and more about knowing. Faith as trust, as recognition, as the soul remembering it was never actually separate from God, just temporarily confused about the relationship. Faith as home, not hotel. As being, not becoming. As rest, not restlessness. Harold drove back to his cabin as the sun began its evening descent. Parked the truck, carried the groceries inside, put them away with the kind of attention that turned mundane tasks into meditation. He lit the fire as darkness fell, sat in his chair, opened his journal. "I spent 3 years waiting to be punished," he wrote. "Turns out God was waiting for me to stop punishing myself." Turns out judgment is just seeing yourself clearly, really clearly, and discovering that love sees you clearer still and loves you anyway. Outside, the mountain stood eternal. Inside, Harold Pierce sat whole. Not healed completely. Healing is a process, not an event. But whole in the way that matters most. No longer at war with himself. No longer waiting for permission to exist. No longer believing that mistakes make someone unredeemable. Just a man who'd met an impossible being and learned an even more impossible truth. That grace is real, judgment is love, and the fire everyone fears is just light coming home. Winter came to the Tennessee mountains the way it always did, gradually, then suddenly, transforming green into white overnight. Harold woke one December morning to find his cabin wrapped in snow, silent, pure, the world rendered simple under a blanket of crystalline white. He made coffee, stood at the window, the same window where Sarah's photo now lived, where he'd watched the being disappear into blue light months ago, where he'd witnessed sunsets that felt like prayers. The valley spread below, peaceful under snow, and there, in the distance, barely visible through the falling flakes, a flash of blue. Harold's breath caught. The light pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat made visible. Azure radiance cutting through white morning, beautiful and impossible and somehow expected. He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling warmth bloom there, the same warmth from that night, the same presence, the same knowing that he was being seen, being remembered, being held in a love that transcended distance and dimension and the ordinary rules of possible. "The fire that comes is light that loves," he whispered, remembering the being's words. The blue light pulsed once more, then faded. Not gone, just invisible again, like it had never left, like it was always there, just beyond the frequency his eyes could track. Harold smiled, closed his eyes, let gratitude wash through him without words. Prayer had become this for him, not asking, not pleading, not performing reverence for a distant deity, just opening, feeling, acknowledging the infinite love that held everything, including him, including his mistakes, including the 3 years he'd wasted in self-imposed exile. "Thank you," he breathed, not to the being specifically, to everything, to the universe, to God, to the consciousness that animated stars and snow and broken soldiers who found their way back to wholeness. He understood now, really understood, what the being had tried to teach him. Judgment Day wasn't coming. It was already here, had always been here, was happening in every moment someone chose to see themselves truly and love themselves anyway. The final judgment wasn't a single apocalyptic event where God separated sheep from goats. It was the ongoing, eternal, individual reckoning of consciousness with itself. The moment every soul faced its shadow and chose light. The instant every heart stopped believing in separation and remembered unity. It was happening now, in him, in everyone ready to stop running from their own reflection. No trumpets, no angels with swords, no dramatic destruction of the unworthy. Just light, quiet, persistent, unstoppable light. Burning away every lie, every pretense, every wall built between self and truth, and beneath all the burning, love, always love. The fire was grace, the judgment was homecoming, the end was actually beginning. Harold opened his eyes. The valley stretched peaceful and white before him. No sound, no pain, just unity, just the deep knowing that he'd never actually been alone, never actually been separate, never actually been abandoned by God. Behind him, the fireplace suddenly flared to life. No wood added, no match struck, just flame appearing where darkness had been, illuminating the cabin with golden warmth. Harold turned and saw it dancing in the hearth, saw it catching Sarah's photograph on the windowsill, making her smile seem alive, saw it reflecting off the scorched symbol still visible on the floor, the eye wreathed in flame that had appeared the night everything changed. He laughed, soft and sure, because he finally got the joke. God had never been distant. Grace had never been conditional. Forgiveness had never been withheld. The only thing that had ever separated him from divine love was the story he'd told himself about being separate. And the moment he stopped believing that story, the walls dissolved like they'd never existed, which, in the truest sense, they hadn't. Harold moved to the fire, stood before it, feeling warmth on his face, in his chest, in his bones. "I understand now," he said to the flames, to the universe, to whatever was listening. Judgment isn't punishment. It's revelation. It's seeing clearly. It's the moment we stop pretending and start remembering. The fire danced higher, as if in agreement. And we've always been in God. We just forgot. We built stories about separation and believed them so hard they became our reality. But the truth? He smiled. The truth is we're in God the way a wave is in the ocean. Never separate. Never alone. Just temporarily convinced of our own independence. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, fire continued burning. And Harold Pierce stood reconciled with his past, with his guilt, with James and Sarah and every ghost he'd carried. Reconciled with God, with light, with the eternal love that had never stopped holding him, even when he'd stopped believing it was there. His vigil was over. The watching, the waiting, the penance. Not because he'd earned forgiveness, because he'd finally accepted what had always been freely given. Harold looked at Sarah's photograph one more time, at her smile, at the mountains beyond, at the snow falling like grace made visible. "The judgment isn't the end," he whispered. "It's the instant we discover we've always been in God, always been loved, always been whole." The fire crackled its agreement, and in that moment, in that cabin in the Tennessee mountains, Harold Pierce was finally, completely, impossibly at peace. Not because the world had changed, because he had, and that changed everything. Judgment is not the end. It is the instant when humanity discovers it was always in God.